In 1858, a man named William Avery Rockefeller disappeared. Not metaphorically, not gradually. He was there, and then he was not there, and the family he left behind never fully explained where he went or why. He had been a traveling salesman, a con man by most accounts, a bigamist who had married a second woman in a different state while still legally married to the first. He sold fake cancer cures from the back of a wagon. He cheated people in small towns across the Midwest and then moved on before they could find him. He was not a wealthy man. He was not a connected man. He was not a man with access to capital or banking relationships or industrial contacts. He was a fraud who traveled with a medicine show and left behind a wife and 6 children in a farmhouse in upstate New York with no money and no prospects and no indication that anything remarkable was about to happen to any of them. And then something happened. Within 20 years, his son John would be the richest man in the world. Within 30 years, the Rockefeller family would control more wealth than most governments. Within 40 years, their influence would reach into banking, medicine, education, politics, and the emerging structures of American foreign policy in ways that have never fully been unwound. The question that the official history of the Rockefellers answers very quickly and very smoothly is, where did the money come from? The answer given is oil. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870. He used aggressive business tactics to eliminate competition. He built a monopoly. He became rich. That answer is true, but it is incomplete in ways that become very uncomfortable when you start asking the questions that answer does not address. How does a man with no capital, no connections, no family wealth, and no banking relationships build the largest oil monopoly in history in less than a decade? Where does the initial investment come from? Who trusted him with enough money to begin? And why does the paper trail before 1858, before his father disappeared, lead almost nowhere? John Davison Rockefeller was born in 1839 in Richford, New York. His father, William, was rarely present. His mother, Eliza, managed the household, raised the children, maintained the farm. The family moved several times during John's childhood, following William's erratic movements and occasional returns. By the time John was a teenager, the family had relocated to Cleveland, Ohio. By the time he was 16, William had effectively abandoned them. John left school at 16 to find work. He was methodical, serious, deeply religious, careful with money in ways that seemed almost compulsive to people who knew him. He worked as a bookkeeper. He saved every cent. He kept meticulous records of every transaction, a habit he maintained for the rest of his life in ledgers he called his personal account books. These ledgers exist. They are archived and partially studied, and they begin in 1855 when John was 16 years old. They are extraordinarily detailed, and they show a young man with almost nothing, recording donations of 10 cents to his church, recording the purchase of a notebook for 3 cents, recording every small transaction with the precision of someone who has so little that every penny matters. This is the documented financial reality of John D. Rockefeller in 1855, a 16-year-old bookkeeper in Cleveland with pennies to his name and a father who sold fake cancer cures from a wagon. Now skip forward to 1870. John Rockefeller is 31 years old. He founds Standard Oil of Ohio with an initial capitalization of $1 million. $1 million in 1870 is approximately $25 million in today's money. He does not borrow this money from a bank. He does not inherit it. He assembles it from a small group of partners whose backgrounds and motivations have never been fully examined. His partners include his brother William, a man named Henry Flagler, and a Cleveland businessman named Samuel Andrews. The question that economic historians have never fully answered is where a 31-year-old former bookkeeper from a destitute family in upstate New York acquired the relationships, the credibility, and the access to capital necessary to assemble $1 million in 1870. The standard answer points to his years in the commodities trading business during the Civil War. He had made money. He had built relationships. He was known as reliable and methodical. This is true as far as it goes, but it does not fully bridge the gap between the young man recording 10-cent church donations in 1855 and the man assembling a $1 million oil company in 1870. Something happened in that 15-year window that the official history describes but does not fully illuminate. And the person who disappeared in 1858 is the shadow that falls across that window every time you look at it carefully. William Avery Rockefeller did not simply disappear in 1858. He reappeared, under a different name, in a different state, with a different wife. He had married a woman named Margaret Allen in Nichols, New York, while still legally married to Eliza. He had moved to the upper Midwest. He had taken on an assumed identity and continued his career as a traveling medicine man. These facts are documented. They are not disputed. What is disputed, or rather what is simply not discussed in most accounts of Rockefeller family history, is the nature of William's business activities and the extent of his connections. Because the thing about successful con men in 19th century America, the ones who operated at scale, who moved across state lines and maintained multiple identities over decades, is that they did not operate alone. They needed networks. They needed people who could move money across state lines without leaving obvious records. They needed the early infrastructure of what we would now call financial crime. And the men who built that infrastructure in the 1850s and 1860s were not petty criminals. They were the architects of certain corners of American finance in a period before federal regulation existed to distinguish clearly between sharp business practice and outright fraud. The line between legitimate and illegitimate capital accumulation in 1850s America was not where we would draw it today. And William Avery Rockefeller lived and worked on that line his entire adult life. What he passed on to his son, whether deliberately or simply through the connections that a man like William inevitably accumulated, has never been properly examined. Henry Flagler is the person in this story who deserves far more scrutiny than he receives. Flagler was John Rockefeller's most important early partner. Without Flagler, there is no Standard Oil as it actually developed. Flagler brought something to the partnership that Rockefeller lacked in the late 1860s: access to capital and to the railroad relationships that would prove essential to Standard Oil's business model. The question of where Flagler's capital came from leads to his father-in-law, a man named Stephen Harkness. Harkness was wealthy. The official source of his wealth is described as whiskey distilling during the Civil War. Wartime whiskey production was extraordinarily profitable. Government contracts, guaranteed demand, minimal regulation. This explanation is plausible. It is also the explanation given for a remarkable number of sudden fortunes accumulated in the 1860s, fortunes whose actual origins are somewhat more complicated than a single industry accounts for. Harkness invested $250,000 in Standard Oil at its founding. He never took an active role in the company. He took his returns and remained invisible. His name does not appear prominently in most histories of Standard Oil, despite being one of its essential founding investors. This is the pattern that repeats throughout the early financial history of the Rockefeller enterprise. Money arrives from people who are not subsequently visible. Investments are made by men who do not seek recognition. Capital appears at precisely the right moment from sources that are described but not examined. And at the center of it all is a man who started with nothing and ended with everything, and whose explanation for how he got from one to the other has always been just coherent enough to satisfy people who do not push too hard. The Standard Oil business model is where the story of John D. Rockefeller intersects with the documented corruption of American infrastructure in ways that even mainstream historians acknowledge, even if they tend to describe them as aggressive business rather than something darker. The key was the railroads. Specifically, it was a secret arrangement that Standard Oil negotiated with the major railroads of the Northeast and Midwest beginning in the early 1870s. The arrangement was called the South Improvement Company, and when it became public knowledge in 1872, it caused a national scandal. The South Improvement Company gave Standard Oil secret rebates on shipping rates. Every barrel of oil Standard Oil shipped was charged a published rate. Standard Oil then received a private rebate that reduced their actual cost dramatically. But here is the part that made the scandal genuinely explosive. Standard Oil also received rebates on oil shipped by their competitors. Every time a competitor shipped oil on those railroads, Standard Oil received a payment. Their competitors were directly subsidizing the company that was destroying them, and they did not know it. This was not aggressive business practice in any ordinary sense. It was a secret financial mechanism that used the infrastructure of American commerce to extract money from competitors without their knowledge or consent. The railroads that participated in this arrangement were not naive partners who did not understand what they were enabling. They were institutions run by men with their own motivations for wanting the oil industry consolidated under single control. Men like Cornelius Vanderbilt and Jay Gould, who had their own complicated relationships with legitimate and illegitimate capital. The South Improvement Company scandal was eventually suppressed. The arrangement was officially canceled under public pressure. But Standard Oil's competitive advantage was by then so entrenched that the cancellation of the formal arrangement did not matter. The company continued to grow. The methods simply became less visible. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of American oil refining. 90%. In less than a decade from a standing start. The speed of this consolidation is not fully explained by even the most aggressive interpretation of legitimate business tactics. Historians of the period have documented hundreds of cases in which independent oil operators were approached by Standard Oil representatives, offered below-market prices for their businesses, and told explicitly that if they did not sell, they would be driven out of business through preferential railroad rates. Some refused and were driven out. Most sold. The pattern was so consistent and so documented that it eventually led to a congressional investigation and, ultimately, to the Supreme Court decision in 1911 that broke Standard Oil into 34 separate companies. But by 1911, the Rockefeller fortune was already one of the largest accumulations of private wealth in human history. The breakup of Standard Oil did not diminish it. It multiplied it. Because John D. Rockefeller owned shares in all 34 successor companies. When the monopoly was broken up, the combined value of those companies exceeded the value of the original. The legal mechanism designed to reduce his power made him significantly richer. This outcome was so counterintuitive that many observers at the time suspected it had been deliberately engineered. The documentary evidence for deliberate engineering is not conclusive, but the result is not in dispute. The man who supposedly lost the antitrust case ended it significantly wealthier than when it began. The role of the Rockefeller family in American medicine is the chapter of this story that has the most direct relevance to the world we live in today, and the least visibility in standard histories. In the early 20th century, John D. Rockefeller Jr. and his advisor, Frederick Gates, began a systematic effort to reshape American medical education. They funded the Flexner Report of 1910, a comprehensive survey of American medical schools that condemned most existing medical education as inadequate and recommended dramatic consolidation around a specific scientific model. The Flexner Report was used to close the majority of American medical schools. Schools that taught herbal medicine, homeopathy, naturopathy, and other approaches were deemed unscientific and defunded. The schools that survived and flourished were those that aligned with a pharmaceutical approach to medicine, the treatment of symptoms with chemical compounds rather than the prevention of disease through diet, lifestyle, and natural remedies. The pharmaceutical industry that grew to dominate American medicine in the 20th century was one in which the Rockefeller family had significant investment interests. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented economic history. The foundation funded the report. The report closed the schools. The schools that remained taught the model that generated demand for the products in which the foundation was invested. The outcome was a medical system built around a specific economic logic, and it was built in the early 20th century by the family whose patriarch had begun his career in the shadow of a father who sold fake cancer cures from the back of a wagon. The symmetry is not comfortable to sit with. The Rockefeller Foundation was established in 1913. It became one of the most influential private institutions in the world within a decade. Its stated mission was the promotion of the well-being of humanity throughout the world. Its actual activities were somewhat more specific. It funded universities. It funded public health programs. It funded agricultural research. It funded social science research. And it consistently funded programs that aligned with a particular vision of how human society should be organized, a vision that tended to concentrate expertise in the hands of credentialed professionals, to consolidate decision-making in large institutions, and to move governance away from local community control toward centralized expert management. These are not neutral choices. They are choices with consequences that have shaped education, medicine, agriculture, and policy in ways that the people affected by them were rarely in a position to question, because the framing of those choices as scientific and objective and philanthropic made questioning them seem like opposition to progress itself. The genius of the Rockefeller Foundation was not that it imposed its vision by force. It was that it made its vision feel like the natural direction of history, like the only rational way for modern civilization to develop. And it did this so effectively that most people today operate within institutions shaped by those early 20th century funding decisions without knowing that those institutions were deliberately designed rather than organically evolved. The question that all of this history circles but never fully answers is the original one. Where did the money come from? Not the later money, the oil money, the monopoly money, the railroad rebate money. That money has a documented, if uncomfortable, history. The original money. The capital that allowed a 31-year-old former bookkeeper with no family wealth and no obvious connections to assemble $1 million company in 1870. The shadow of William Avery Rockefeller falls across that question every time it is asked. A man who lived under assumed names, who moved money across state lines in an era before financial regulation, who maintained connections in the murky overlap between legitimate commerce and organized fraud, who disappeared from his family's official history at precisely the moment when his son's financial trajectory began its inexplicable upward arc. The official history of the Rockefeller family begins with John's industriousness and vision and religious discipline and methodical habits. It begins in 1870 with Standard Oil. It points backward to his years in commodities trading as the source of his initial capital. And then it stops. It does not go back to 1858. It does not examine what happened in the years immediately before the oil business began in the context of what William Avery Rockefeller was doing and who he knew and what he might have passed on. The paper trail before 1858 is thin. The explanations for why it is thin are not entirely satisfying. And the distance between a man recording 10-cent church donations in 1855 and the founder of the largest oil monopoly in history in 1870 remains, if you look at it honestly, a gap that the official story acknowledges but does not close. There is one final detail that I want to leave you with, because it is small and specific, and it has stayed with me since I first encountered it. William Avery Rockefeller, the con man who sold fake cancer cures and abandoned his family and lived under assumed names and disappeared in 1858, did not actually disappear entirely. He lived until 1906. He died at the age of 95 or 96 in Freeport, Illinois, still using the assumed name he had taken decades earlier. He was, by the end of his life, aware that his son was the richest man in the world. John D. Rockefeller was aware that his father was still alive. The two men maintained occasional contact throughout the decades when William was officially a ghost and John was officially a self-made man with no explanation for the gap in his financial history that anyone needed to take seriously. The father who gave the son nothing, officially, lived quietly in Illinois while his son built the most powerful private fortune in American history and funded the reshaping of medicine and education and public policy in the richest country on earth. And the son who came from nothing, officially, never fully explained how he got from nothing to everything in the years when his vanished father was not quite as vanished as the official history required him to be. The records are incomplete. The explanations are insufficient. And the gap between what we know and what we can prove is exactly wide enough to contain any number of things that powerful families with the resources to shape their own historical record would prefer to remain permanently, professionally, and plausibly unexplained.